WCDs. So Jim, if you want to take it from here. You're muted, Jim. And I should just let folks know that we are recording this. So if you want to not be visible on video, you can stop your video at the bottom as well.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I am now unmuted and my usual state. Thank you everyone for coming, and for those who we haven't heard yet, Rebecca had mentioned earlier, if you just joined us, please go to the chat box on the bottom and enter in your name and your affiliation. Welcome to our watershed webinar, which is sponsored by Land Use Council 16. There are 97 soil and water conservation districts throughout the state of Illinois, give or take one or two. And there are 16 land use councils, which are different land use councils in different parts of the state that combine and have a council, and we meet at least quarterly to discuss issues that are relevant to the districts and to the state. One of the things that we do at the districts and with the land use council is we address issues regarding watersheds and water quality. And part of that, we certainly do work in the field and work with producers and also with constituents who have issues. We also get presentations of, that are often given at the Land Use Council, such as this one that we're giving today. Some of the issues that are addressed by the water conservation districts involve agriculture and also conservation needs. Individual districts have different soil health initiatives. One of the statewide initiatives, which just got a new director, is called STAR. STAR stands for Saving Tomorrow's Agricultural Resources, and that's a program that's been in effect for a couple of years now, I believe, and that is also directed toward helping with the health and preservation of our soils. The presentation today is going to consist of 4 different people who you're going to hear from. It's on the agenda, which should be on your screen. Steve Zimmerman, Dean Johnson, Terry Lee, and Lauren Lurkins. I'm not going to read what's already on your screen, but we've got an excellent panel to inform you today as to the issues that you will be hearing about with regard to the watershed webinar today. So, is also, Rebecca had mentioned, please keep your mute button on so that we don't hear somebody's dog barking, although we all like dogs, I presume, but that won't help with the presentation of the seminar. So everybody, thank you again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Jim. I also want to thank Laura Riley from Chicago Wilderness, who is hosting today. And I'm going to turn it to her for a brief moment here to put up a poll. We'd like to just kind of get a sense of where folks are in terms of familiarity with watersheds and watershed planning, because we're going to teach you today about those and give you a chance to have a conversation, but we'd like to just gauge where folks are. So Laura, if you want to go ahead and launch that poll. Great, so you should all see a question there. You can choose multiple answers for this first question. What type of organization do you represent? Choose all that apply. So if I can see folks are starting to answer that. And then there's also a second question. Have you ever participated in a farmer-led watershed planning process before? Great, we've got about half of folks in, 2/3, and it looks like not a ton of folks have done watershed planning before, so that's great. You'll have a lot to learn today and plenty of opportunity to follow up, and we're just really glad that you're here. And if you didn't catch at the beginning, at some point when you're done with the poll, go ahead and put your name and organization in the chat at the bottom. Okay, the poll is closed. So it looks like we've got mostly folks who work for local government or municipalities, so that's probably our SWCD folks, nonprofits, consultant companies, quite a few, and also landowners. And then about 81% of folks said they have not participated in a watershed planning process before. So great, thank you so much for participating in that. And we will go ahead and get right into it here. So our first presenter is going to be Steve Zimmerman, and he's going to address the basics of a watershed and watershed planning. So Steve is a principal restoration ecologist and project manager. Since 2001, he has worked in natural resources restoration and management. His specialties include stream ecology, prairie, woodland, and wetland restoration, stream and lakeshore restoration, watershed planning, green infrastructure planning, vegetation surveys, monitoring, fisheries management, water quality monitoring, and wetland evaluations. In addition, many aspects of these projects include acquiring and administering permits, preparation of construction documents, erosion control design, and natural resources surveying. Steve has also given dozens of ecological related presentations to clients and the general public. So if you're still seeing that poll, you can go ahead and close it by just Xing it out on your screen. And again, please make sure you're muted and put your name and organization in the chat at the very bottom. So with that, I turn it over to Steve. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, so that was my long bio there. I've been with Applied Ecological Services for 18 years. I've been doing watershed planning from the beginning. We do a lot of watershed planning. Cecily Coons, our senior planner, we work together now on watershed plans. And we've done quite a few in the last 10, 15 years. So I'm sort of tasked today with providing the basics about what is a watershed plan. I realize a lot of you know, but I'm assuming there was a lot of people on the line that don't know. And then basically, once you have a watershed plan in place, how do you use it so it doesn't sit on the shelf? You know, how do you use it to get grants and plan for development and things like that? Patrick, you can go to the next slide. So I always sort of give this little brief summary so everyone kind of gets an idea of what my company does leading into this. We're an ecological consulting and restoration company. We have 3 branches. I work in the consulting branch. We have a contracting branch that installs and builds ecological restoration projects. And we also have native plant nurseries and that supply our seed and plants for our projects. And really our vision is that we want to bring the science of ecology to all land use decisions. Next slide. Okay, so the basics, right? What is a watershed? Quite simply, and you can see on this image, it's an area of land that drains to a certain location. So in other words, if it were to rain, one drop of water, if it were not impeded by anything, would make its way down slope through whatever land use down to one point at the base of the watershed before it enters like a stream or a lake or something like that. Next slide. And what is watershed planning? So to sum it up as brief as possible, it's voluntary. That's important to note is it's voluntary and usually a community supported approach, municipalities or farmers, for example, if it's largely an agricultural watershed, but it's an approach at protecting and improving the surface and groundwater quality, surface water quality first and foremost, but also restoring and managing natural areas, reducing flood problems, and producing and providing recreational opportunities for people. That's one thing that's often overlooked. Next slide, please. So this sort of sums up a lot of the watershed planning that's been done in Northeast Illinois. Sort of the colored areas on the map, this is from CMAP, I believe, are all watershed plans that are in place or have been done. The red ones are the ones that AES has done. We've done quite a few, and there's a couple on here that aren't actually outlined. So we've done a lot of this planning in the last 10, 15 years, not just in Northeast Illinois, but in Wisconsin and Iowa. And I want to make it really clear that AES produces ecologically focused watershed plans. And because we believe that the land, when it's healthy, sort of it improves all these things we're looking to make better, like water quality and habitat, groundwater. There are other firms that do more of a engineering-based plan, but again, we're focused on improving the health of the land to reach our goals. Next slide. So let's go back 30, 40 years, whatever this is. 1987, Congress enacted Section 319 of the Clean Water Act. And what that was a program to help improve non-point source pollution. In other words, pollutants that do not come out of a permitted pipe, like a treatment plant. So we're talking about things that flow over the land, over agricultural land, over other types of land that aren't point sources. And it's delegated to the states. Illinois, by the way, has a very strong 319 grant program, and I'll show you why as we get deeper into this. And this, the Clean Water Act, it is basically encourages municipalities and other agencies to adopt watershed plans and the BMPs within them. And I said this earlier, it's voluntary. So nothing is enforceable in a watershed plan unless a community wants to adopt a plan and actually make things enforceable. And this last bold point here, all watershed plans, and this is as of about 10 or 15 years ago, have to meet what the EPA calls the 9 elements. So if we go to the next slide, this is a summary of the 9 elements. I'm not going to go through these specifically, but what the EPA was seeing is they were getting watershed plans that were just all across the board and really sort of didn't match up and were not consistent. And so they developed these 9 elements so that all watershed plans moving forward, specifically if they're funded by the EPA, have sort of the same layout. And without going through these in a whole lot of detail, they want you to identify where the problems are coming from, do pollutant loading to see what kind of actual pollutants might be coming from certain areas. They want you to find projects that you can sort of throw onto these problem areas and figure out what kind of pollutants could potentially be removed. There's an education component. They want you to develop kind of scorecards on how to assess the plan in the future, and develop a whole set of different action plans, which we'll get to. Next slide. So these are the watershed planning steps. At least this is the way AES approaches them. They're not all in here, but these are the main points. So the 9 elements are addressed through this process. And the next 4 or 5 slides, we'll go through each one of these bullets in more detail, but we start out with an inventory. We drive around the watershed. We then have a desktop inventory of all the characteristics in the watershed. We look at water quality and pollutant loading, the vision and goals. You'll notice this is sort of buried later instead of coming first. So when we have stakeholder meetings, which are held throughout this process, we want all the stakeholders to have all the information about what's going on in the watershed before we actually develop the vision and goals and objectives, if that makes sense. And then towards the end of the planning is where we come up with our critical areas, what spots in the watershed need attention. And we develop action plans and a green infrastructure, education, water quality, site specific. And when the plan is done, we recommend stakeholders adopt the plan, implement its recommendations, and make some of them required if they'd like. Next slide. So to go through those bullet points in a little more detail, when doing a watershed plan at AES, we feel like probably one of the most important things is to get into the watershed and look at it, each watershed we've found has sort of this different personality, if you will. And we found that we like to put almost 20-25% of our budget aside just to go into the field, and we drive around. So we have these maps on the left. We sort of have this index map, and then for each number on there, we have a blow up map, which you see on the right, of every single tile. And we drive around and we just look for issues, problems, opportunities. And when we find them, and we pull out our pen, we get out of the car, we take pictures, we document everything on the map, and we have a data sheet for each one of these little different areas you see where we get information. And then this information is built into the watershed plan later on. Specifically, where do we want to build projects to improve water quality? Also note, starting with this slide, this is the Woods Creek watershed. On the left, you see there, it's partially in Crystal Lake, Lake in the Hills, and Algonquin on the west side of the Fox River. And I'm going to use this watershed plan as an example moving forward because it's about 8 or 10 years old and it's been extremely successful. Next slide. Okay, so now we get in, we've done the field inventory, and now we get into the watershed characteristics. And this is more of a desktop survey here where we get all the GIS data we can get, the water quality data, anything we can find. And then we go through and we put together all these different sections of the plan. And everything from looking at the topography, the soils, the vegetation, how the demographics might change, land use changes from existing to future, green infrastructure, natural areas, drainage, all these different things, groundwater. And I should mention, we do look at groundwater when we have data available, but it's important to note groundwater is not directly linked to the watershed above. It can expand beyond, but they are interrelated. And an ordinance review. So we do things like we ask villages to look at their ordinances and compare them to a standard to see how they might be able to improve their ordinances to improve watershed health. Next slide, please. So we also look deeply at water quality. Obviously, 319 watershed plans are based on water quality specifically. And so we go out, we collect samples if we don't actually have water quality. We run models, we sort of tie these two together. And what we get from this sort of analysis are, we use this model here to develop the images you're seeing. The bottom left is a graphic of what you see on the right, but a pollutant loading analysis can be done using different types of programs. We use STEPL a lot because the EPA approves that, but it sorts out particularly nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment. That's what the EPA is mainly looking at. And this model sort of shows based on the land use, hey, where are the problems coming from? And then when we find those on the map on the right, these are smaller sub-watersheds in the larger watershed where most of the pollutants are coming from. So potential projects that fall in these smaller sub-watersheds that are higher priority to implement, obviously. The other thing you don't see in this watershed is sometimes you do have things like treatment plants built into this that add to the water quality. But again, these plans address non-point sources and not permitted sources like treatment plants. Next slide. So once we've looked at all the data, we have our pollutant loading, we know what the pollutant problems are, we've done the BMP inventory, what we do is we compile all the highest priority projects, if you will, and that's what you're seeing on the map. This is what I like to call the most important map in the whole watershed plan. It's all of the critical areas in the watershed shown on one map. Everything from all the stream projects, detention basins, open space, wetland restoration, everything's shown on one map. And then what we do is we go back to that pollutant model and we build in these potential projects, and it backs out pollutants in the model to see if, by putting in all these critical area projects, can we actually get to the target water quality that we want? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. And if we can't, we try to find more projects. Next slide. Visits, there we go. Another thing we look at is green infrastructure planning. So again, on the left, this is the Woods Creek watershed, and we do what's called a parcel-based green infrastructure layout in our plans, where each parcel is assigned points based on whether it meets certain things that help improve the watershed, and the higher priority parcels then become part of the green infrastructure network. And I show this example because this is a golf course you see circled on the left here that recently was sold to a developer, and they're building homes on it. And the developer came to the village and said, hey, here's the development we want to put in. Well, it was a traditional type development. And the watershed plan says, hey, look, we've got all these green corridors. This golf course is one of them. If it's converted to something else, it should remain green infrastructure. So the developer, the municipality required the developer to go back and completely redesign the subdivision to include all of these green infrastructure connections. So that's one way the watershed plan can be used as far as looking at green infrastructure and future planning. Next slide. So our site-specific action plans look something like this. Again, we look for ecologically focused projects, everything from stream bank erosion, detention basin retrofits, wetlands, agricultural practices, green infrastructure, natural areas. And for each one of these topics, we develop a map that you see on the right. Obviously, all the maps aren't here. For every single one of those topics, we then use our field inventory to pull out projects, and we have priorities. So like the yellow on the maps you see is medium priority. The red, those are all those high priority critical areas that become part of that one map I said that has all the critical areas on it. And then the next slide continues with this action plan. There we go. So for each one of those maps, then we have a table, and the tables are sorted by the municipality. So a municipality, for example, you can see on the brown area on the map, that's Algonquin. They flip to their section of the action plan, and it lists by category the types of projects. So this is an example of a stream restoration at the headwaters of Woods Creek. That is an agricultural area, very degraded stream, and it was called a critical area. And again, critical areas are what the EPA wants to spend their 319 money on for grants. So the village, on to the next slide. Sorry about the delay here. At least I have a delay. There we go. So the village of Algonquin knew they had this critical area stream reach, and they wanted to improve it. There's a walking path along it. It's a very high use area. We basically helped them apply for a 319 grant for reaches 1 and 2. And it's important to note for those that might want to go through this process, you need to start the grant process at least 4 to 6 months before it's due. The 319 grant is due on August 1st every year in Illinois, but that gives time to put the grant together to develop a concept plan at a minimum to submit to the EPA. The EPA has come to a point where they will not fund a project unless it's a project in a watershed plan, specifically one of those high priority critical areas. And I want to make another point. When you submit the grants, you have to have at least a concept plan in place with a good cost estimate that the EPA can look at and say you've done your homework a little bit. And my last bullet point here, you will get many more points if the grant submitted actually contains the final plans and permitting in place for the project. That was what Algonquin did in this case. They spent $100 grand up front to do the design and permitting, as you can see on this slide. And when they submitted it to the EPA, it was a no-brainer. It's shovel ready, and we got the grant, and we went in, we designed this. So this is now in a case where if you had not designed and permitted it, the typical process would be, it's a 2-year grant. The first year you design and permit the project. The second year is when you usually construct it. And what some people aren't aware of in these 319 grants is that you can actually build in 3 years of maintenance and monitoring to get all the native plant communities established, and the EPA will pay for that. And the pictures here just show you like how we went from the before and after. This picture on the bottom right is just after. Here's some more pictures of it. So this is now, I'm going to show you how each municipality used the plan to construct a project. So Woods Creek reaches 1 and 2, we just talked about, and the headwaters, everything flows north here, sort of where you're looking at this. This is a 3,000 linear foot stream restoration. AES designed it. NCAP won the bid on this and built it back in 2017. And you can see the before and after pictures there. This was a $600,000 project, 60% paid for by the EPA. Next slide.
Steve, I'm just going to interrupt very briefly. We got started a couple minutes
Yep.
late, so we can go a couple minutes longer, but we did have one question come in, but if you want to start wrapping up, and then we can ask a question.
I think
and if
I got
anyone
just a couple more. Yep, I got a couple more and we're done. So Woods Creek Reach 10, this is in Lake in the Hills. This was $2,500. This was an $800,000 stream restoration. We assisted HR Green with the design, and we actually won the build on this. The before picture and the after was like just after construction, again, of stream restoration. And the third example on the next slide. There we go. This is Fetzner Park. This is in Crystal Lake Park District. Another stream corridor project funded 60% by the EPA. We helped the client get a grant, and they basically improved this stream reach in a park. And next slide, I think we're really close here.
Great. We did have one question come in. If anyone has additional questions, if you could type them in at the bottom in the chat box, just bring your cursor down and you should see a taskbar pop up. So the question that came in was, after the watershed plan is complete, who has ownership over it? For example, who called out the traditional developing the golf course?
So who has ownership? So technically, everyone that is a stakeholder has some ownership, and a lot of times the stakeholders provide money up front as part of the match to do the watershed planning. And again, it's a voluntary community thing. So I mean, technically the client that is our client has true ownership, but it can be used by any stakeholder in the watershed. And then what was the second part of the question? I didn't quite get that.
For example, who called out the traditional develop in the golf course?
Meaning what developer called it out? Because that I probably shouldn't say. I could just say it was a typical developer that wanted to do traditional development at the best cost that they could do it for, and the village said no, it's part of our green infrastructure, it has to have many more green infrastructure attributes to it, and then the developer had to go back and completely revise the plan.
Great. And then we just had a comment come in. I grew up in Algonquin, so it's great to see this kind of work being done. Nice feedback.
Algonquin is a leader in the Chicago area. They have done just an incredible job with their natural resources. Yes.
And then one more. AES plans are very user-friendly and functional. We have 2 approved plans with AES, and we have used them to make a significant difference in Southeast Wisconsin. So that's a nice comment. And then we have a question. How specific do the BMPs named in the watershed plan need to be in order to be fundable in 319 grants? For example,
go ahead.
For example, do each kind of ag BMPs need to be explicitly mentioned in the watershed plan? And we'll,
Yes, is the short answer. Yes is the short answer. They need to be site specific and shown on one of those maps and called out specifically in the table as a project. But they only need to be identified. So the next phase then is usually you develop at least a concept plan to take it to the next step. So yeah, obviously we don't go that far, but that's the next step, is to spend a little bit of money to further develop the project, to figure out more specifics, how much it's going to cost, and then you can take it to a grant.
Great, thank you. Steve, if you want to type your contact information into the chat box, that's probably a good way of making sure folks can get that. And I want to thank you very much for all this fantastic information and for your time today. He'll be sticking around with us, so you'll have more chances to interact a bit later. But moving on to the next presentation, we're going to be hearing from Dean Johnson. Dean is the Executive Director of the DeKalb County Soil and Water Conservation District. Dean has been with the district for 19 years. He also serves as the Watershed Coordinator in DeKalb County. Dean and his wife Charlene have 3 children and live and operate an agritainment business on the family farm near Sycamore, Illinois. And Dean is going to be speaking to DeKalb's history of watershed planning. So I will turn it over to you, Dean, and if folks want to type in questions as Dean presents, we can answer those at the end.
Good morning, everybody. We're really excited that we can do this today and talk about watersheds. I'm specifically going to talk about what we're doing in DeKalb County. And for most of you, I'm sure you know where DeKalb County is, but for those who may not, we're kind of in the north central part of the state of Illinois. And we're about 60 miles west of Chicago. And we used to have a young man that worked in our office that thought that anything north of Interstate 80 was Chicago. And actually DeKalb County is very much a rural community. It has probably about 85 to 88% of the county is still in agriculture. And so much of our watershed planning works a lot with the ag community. So we'll move ahead. Just to give you a little bit of background here, if you look at the maps provided, the major watersheds in Illinois, we're up at the very top of the map. The Kishwaukee River watershed stretches up into Wisconsin a little bit, up by Walworth, and then it comes down and catches the bottom end in DeKalb County, down by the village of Shabana. We've specifically been working in the northern part of the county in the Kishwaukee River watershed, which occupies about 2/3 of the county. The map in the middle shows the dark blue area. That's the Kishwaukee River watershed. In DeKalb County, most of this water flows to the north and to the west, and eventually ends up in the Rock River up near the Rockford Airport in Winnebago County. The other major watershed in the county is the Fox River, which is in the southern third of the county. And we also have small portions of the Rock and the Green River watersheds, which just barely come into the western side of DeKalb County. Go ahead. So to talk a little bit about the history of the county, I think you almost have to go back to when the European settlers came to the area. Back in those days, there was probably some watershed planning that was going on as they started to realize that a lot of this low ground, which at the time probably was, swamp, wetlands, when they were able to drain off that water, that was pretty productive ground. And, most of the most of the work that was done back in those early days was all done by hand. In fact, you know, I live on a farm. You can still see probably some of that early tile work that was done that's starting to fail now because it's been in the ground, you know, well over 100 years. But early planning probably happened when the neighbors got together and decided that they wanted to do some drainage in their communities. Okay. So let's move ahead about 200 years and talk about what's going on with our current watershed planning. Just to give you a little bit of background, I'm going to talk basically about the people, the groups that started this back probably in the late 2000s. The DeKalb County Stormwater Management and Planning Committee, which is a subcommittee of the county board. They began, you know, doing ordinance work as far as developing stormwater management programs in the county. And then we have a group called the DeKalb County Community Foundation. They're a group made up of citizens in the county that are working together, providing funding, trying to do things that will help improve the quality of life in the county. They actually started a group back in the day that looked at what are the things that are important in this county and what can we do to improve the quality of life in our county. Now, we can look, I'm just going to talk briefly about the picture that you're looking at on the screen. When we do watershed planning, and some of these things I'm going to tie back to what Steve talked about, but we do watershed planning. One of the things that we have done with each watershed plan is stakeholder meetings. This was for the first watershed plan that we did with the East Branch of the South Branch of the Kishwaukee River. What we did was we invited stakeholders, people that lived in the watershed, to come to a meeting which was held at the Community Foundation, and we laid out large maps on tables, and we had people go to each table. Basically, these were the folks that lived in this watershed, and they identified areas on these maps that were where there was problems with flooding, or there was, you know, resource concerns of some type. We also had them identify places that were doing good things as well. So this depicts one of the tables and the people discussing this area of the watershed. Okay. So I mentioned that the Community Foundation, back in the early 2000s, they established a Community Works land use impact plan. What they did was they decided to get together as a group, identify issues that are in the county, and tried to work together to help make it better, I guess you could say. One of the things that they did was they sent out a survey to 14 communities in the county, and well, I guess, yeah, 12 responded, and 10 out of the 12 responses from that letter said that water was a major concern of their community. And so one of the things that they did was they gave some grants to these, especially smaller communities, to help them create up-to-date stormwater management ordinances. At that time, those small communities had been going through a large development process. A lot of communities were growing rapidly and weren't quite able to manage the issues they were having with stormwater back in the day. So those were very useful for that time. And then it came to the point where the Community Foundation and the DeKalb County Stormwater Management Committee decided that we would try to do watershed planning in the county. So the concept of it was that we were going to go ahead and get a plan for the whole county. And so the first plan they decided to do was on the east branch of the Kishwaukee River. They hired Hay and Associates and Baxter Woodman, which is an engineering firm in the area. And they applied for and got the first 319 watershed-based planning grant in the county. In 2014, the plan was completed and approved, and is still, in existence today. Go ahead. This is a picture of the east branch of the Kishwaukee River. If you look at it like you could say it looks like a butterfly. The east branch of the Kish has DeKalb and Kane counties involved, and it's almost split right in half. If you look at the center of that butterfly, that's where the county line is. 84% of this watershed was agriculture. 11 is developed, and then the rest is parks and open space. But there's about 9 communities within that watershed. Okay. Right now we have active planning going on. We're working in the upper south branch of the Kishwaukee River. That includes the city of DeKalb. It's in the center part of the county. The DeKalb County SWCD is the grantee on that watershed planning grant. And then there's a smaller watershed planning grant that was given to the Little Rock Creek watershed. And that's the city of Sandwich, and they hold the grant for that. Okay. This is a map of the upper south branch of the Kishwaukee that we're just about done with. We've sent all the information to the EPA. The final edits are completed, and this is about a 98 square mile area that drains. Again, it goes from south to north, and it meets up with the east branch of the Kishwaukee River. So the water coming from Kane County towards Sycamore hooks up with this and then travels north. Applied Ecological Services, they've been the consultants with this. And then this is the Little Rock Creek watershed, which is tucked into the very corner, the southeast corner of our county, and goes a little bit into Kendall County. This is a part of the Fox River watershed. And again, the city of Sandwich is in charge of this one. Applied Ecological Services is the consultant for this. And it's about 10,000 acres in size. And that one should be completed, within the year. It's about 10,000 acres, as I mentioned, in size. Okay. Planning for these watershed projects, it's very important to involve your community. We had bus tours that we conducted for the plan. On the left, we were able to go to the Water Reclamation District in DeKalb. And then we also visited Bears Research Farm in Waterman. The center picture is one of the landowners that where the watershed starts, talks about the history of that farm and how that was developed in that area. So we've worked a lot with the Community Foundation, the Kishwaukee Water Reclamation District, the Park Districts. All these groups are very important in putting together a watershed plan. They've contributed financially, they've contributed with their time and efforts, and we very much appreciate all those efforts that they put forward. Okay. One of the things that I'm most proud of that has come from watershed planning is we've seen Sycamore High School, which is in the east branch of the Kishwaukee River, develop a watershed course that's held in the summer. So these kids are coming back to school, if it wasn't the pandemic, and they're doing watershed planning doing a watershed planning course. They're going out on the sites and taking samples. NIU has been an integral part of this. They take samples from the Kishwaukee River. The Community Foundation is helping to support that financially. And the bottom picture shows one of the teachers from NIU explaining to the group how they take their samples. So we've got a baseline as far as what we have for, you know, what's going on in the river. Okay. And, you know, this is agriculture's being a big part of this watershed planning. In all the plans so far, more than 80% of the land is ag. We've got drainage districts. This is a picture of the drainage districts in DeKalb County. And most of them are active districts. So you need to make sure that you're involving the drainage districts when you're doing, you know, working with your stakeholders or on your steering committees is important to have them. And then we are focused on talking about the nutrient loss reduction strategy in our plans. And that is something that is important that we keep that at the forefront. And I think,
Dean, I'm just going to hop in quickly here and say we've got just a couple minutes left, and I have one question coming in. So if you want to wrap up a few points, and then we can get into the question that came in and any others that folks want to type into the chat box.
sure thing. And I think this is about the last slide anyway. And we kind of looked forward into the future, what we're planning to do. We have applied for another watershed planning grant for the northern part of the county. So the darker blue areas to the top of the map, those are in the Kishwaukee River watershed. We've applied for another planning grant. We'll find out probably in the spring of 2021 if we've gotten that. We got a letter from the EPA saying that they had over 27 applications. Typically they have $3.5 to $4.5 million to disperse, and there's requests for over $10.9 million. So there's definitely a need for planning. And then, yeah, this is the one thing I wanted to talk about a little bit is the website. We've established a watershed website for our county, very user-friendly. When we're going to do planning and stuff, we're going to make sure that we put like story information on that website, so you can go right to it and see what projects are being that have happened in the area in that watershed. You know, for an example, we've done stuff with the DeKalb Sycamore Park District. Just recently, we did a project with the Kishwaukee Water Reclamation District and the DeKalb Park District on seeding down about 18 acres of native prairie in the area. So much of that is along the river and in detention areas of the Kishwaukee River watershed. So a lot of good things going on. I don't have enough time to talk about everything, but these plans that have been created are very comprehensive, and the ones we've had are very user-friendly. So if you have a project in an area, you can go right into that plan and look for it, and it'll give you the information that you need to develop a grant application for an implementation grant. So implementation is going to be key to make these things work. So I am done with my conversation. So are there any questions?
Great, thank you, Dean. I just want to point out to folks, if the videos are blocking your view of the text on the screen, you can go up and hover your cursor at the very top and select Show Small Active Speaker Video is the one I would suggest, because you'll still see the speaker that way, but you'll see more of the screen. Okay, so the question that came in: since most watersheds and/or water systems drain and flow towards the equator, does the reverse, south to north, flow of the Kish River present any problems or unforeseen issues for watershed planning? Interesting.
No, I think we just treat it like any other watershed. Eventually, it will get to the Rock River and head south. We haven't seen any issues of water flowing north. I had one of the directors on my board said that, well, probably the best thing that could happen is a stick of dynamite on one of the ridges on the western part of the county to just blow that away and allow the water to drain straight to the west to the Mississippi. But he was kidding, of course. But that is not an issue in our watershed as far as drainage. It still drains well.
Great, thank you, Dean. That was the only question I saw come in. So I want to thank Dean very much for sharing all that information. Dean, if you want to type your contact info into the chat box as well, just so that folks have it to do, that would be great. And then we're going to go ahead and move on to our next speaker. So next we have Carrie Lee, who's the Executive Director of Natural Land Institute. Carrie works to protect and restore the natural communities of northern Illinois. She has worked regionally doing watershed planning, facility planning, area and wastewater treatment reviews for the IEPA, and Great Lakes restoration work with local governments. She is also committed to creative and enhanced partnerships and collaborative work approaches. And Carrie is going to be presenting the Healthy Land and Water Partnership. So Carrie, if you want to take it away, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. We're going to take a little journey today into Northwest Illinois, which is primarily an agricultural landscape. And as a not-for-profit organization, we're a conservation land trust. And I just want to talk about the genesis of this project briefly. We worked with the Joe Davies Conservation Foundation, who's within our district, to take a look with one of our major funders, the McKnight Foundation, at the time, to see how could conservation land trusts provide added value to protecting water quality in our region, particularly with the adoption recently in the last few years of the nutrient loss reduction strategy for the state. So let's go to the next slide. And this is our service area. And I just also want to give a big thank you to Applied Ecological Services, one of our partners on this, the project team, for all of the maps in this presentation. They've done a great job. So we decided to take a look at how can we provide kind of better value or other options for landowners in the region. And so we got together and decided that this would be the area that we would look at. So the two nonprofit organizations kind of put in an application preliminary for tier 1 of this project to the McKnight Foundation, which was funded, tier 1 was funded by them, and also by the Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation. So let's go to the next slide. We took a look at pretty much everything initially, like most watershed plans do, like what do you have, what's your inventory? We looked at what are the protected lands, where are the flood zones, the wetlands, the hydric soils. You can see we have Rockford, Freeport, Galena as the main urban areas here in this, and a lot of agricultural areas. So there were basically 2 tiers or 2 phases of the project where we really wanted to start to integrate the concepts of agricultural land use and conservation, and also with some of these municipal needs. So let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk just briefly about tier 1. So next slide. So this part was all about building partnerships and outreach and engaging people. So we brought onto our partner team a communications group, Lewiston Communications, and Applied Ecological Services. We put out an RFP to have them work with us on all the GIS work. So tier 1 was an exploration, really information gathering and setting up the project goals and the scope, and starting to pull in the partnerships. So we put together a steering committee of agencies, agricultural community representatives, local government, nonprofits, and then our technical advisory group, which included some of those representations. And then our large stakeholder meeting, which is a public meeting, was actually held in Freeport, Illinois. Next slide. So we had some deliverables for our funders, which was to really develop a purpose, vision, and goals, which we did with input from both the technical advisory committee and the regional stakeholders through a series of meetings, which culminated in the large stakeholder meeting. And we also did a survey to identify the values that residents, farmers, different groups might have, and some of the current concerns that really stood out to them. And we also had to explore different GIS models. What were we going to use? So let's go to the next slide. So the main purpose that everyone came up with after this whole series of meeting was really we wanted to make sure that our partnership had a real diversity of constituents and some of the groups that we hadn't traditionally worked with before in the conservation community, because we wanted to bridge these conservation interests and needs, which is another reason why we did the survey, and to envision where we could actually work together with our common values and to leverage ways that we could fund this all together for our future economic and health well-being, which is why we call it Healthy Land and Waters. Just a couple of things, the key values that came out of the survey that we found were interesting. The shared value was the sort of rural way of life, family orientation, and family farms as a heritage were the key values for farmers. And then for all the residents, open space and communities. And their most pressing environmental concerns were poor drinking water and urban and suburban sprawl. So we used those really as a background for all the future work that we did. So then we had to decide on the spatial framework for prioritization. What tool are we going to use? So the tool that we took a look at, and that we landed on, is this EPA Watershed Index online tool. And you can go to the next slide. And the thing that was really good about this tool, three main things were that the tool was initiated in 2008 to improve the ways that communities could compare, prioritize, and target watersheds. And they could really assist all the partners in prioritization based on the condition and the suitability of those particular watersheds. And it would also increase the capacity for people to do a watershed comparative analysis. So that's what we really wanted to do, because we had so many of these HUC 12 watersheds that we wanted to look at. And a HUC 12 watershed, it's the hydrologic unit code. And this tool is based on using the data for these hydrologic unit code 12 watersheds throughout the United States. There's actually 83,000 of them. So watersheds are nested within each other. And this tool will allow us to easily download uniformly measured watershed indicators for a defined project area, and then to generate comparative rankings, which we're going to take a look at in a minute. We're going to look at these comparative rankings for the subwatersheds based on ecological stressor and social indicators. So let's go to the next slide. So these indicators are measurable attributes, okay, of both ecological and social conditions. So obviously ecological conditions are plus as our social indicators, and stressor indicators are negatives. Let's go to the next slide. So we've got some examples here. So an ecological indicator might be, for example, the amount of green infrastructure in a wetland. A social indicator might be watershed plans, watershed with total maximum daily load plans, watershed associations. And stressors could be impaired. How much of our waters, of our surface waters, are impaired within the watershed? So let's go to the next slide. So our groups, the groups that we started to take a look at, started to determine which were some of the prime ecological indicators that we wanted to take a look at. And we decided that on some of these as our prime ecological indicators. For example, what's the percent of the open water in the watershed? What's the percent of the natural land cover? What's the percent of protected rare ecosystems? Those kinds of things. Let's go to the next slide. Then we took a look at some stressor indicators. Now, a lot of these are in the tool that we could choose, but we could also add other indicators as long as we had the data. So under the stressor indicators, so what's the percent urban areas in a watershed? Because that gives us, for example, an impervious cover. And impervious cover is another way at taking a look at runoff and pollutant loading in non-point source pollutants. Looking at the percent of developed land, erodibility, cultivated crops, and the agricultural water demand, those kinds of things. So when we take a look then at our social indicators, we have what's the percent of protected land? Do we have conservation reserve programs? Percent of drinking water source protection areas, potential restorable wetlands, any NPDES permit counts. Hey, do you guys have a watershed plan, or is there a TMDL? We wanted to take a look at all of these things. Let's go to the next slide. So once we had these indicators, we then had to make them kind of comparable in some sort of way. So we had to do some normalization and some weighting to give them some flexibility. So these are some example weightings that we did. For example, percent of an impaired 303D listed stream might have a weighting of 5, whereas manure application or synthetic nitrogen could have a weighting of 1. Let's go to the next slide. So the final recovery potential integrated score, then we calculate, we take a look at the ecological stressors and index that we created, and the social index and the stressor index, and then we kind of divided those by 3. This score then gives us a higher recovery potential within each subwatershed that we're looking at. So just to give a little bit more explanation, the ecological and social index values or higher index scores imply a higher probability that the watershed will support ecological services and a higher probability that the social setting is favorable to any actions. And for the stressor index, a lower score implies that there are fewer stressors driving negative change in the wetland. And then for the combined score, higher scores imply a higher likelihood that conditions are favorable to the user's objectives. So these index scores really provide a simple and easily understandable way to compare the relative condition of a group of screened waters, for example, and to organize them from higher to lower likelihood of meeting our objectives based on those scores. So let's take a look at what this output is for us in terms of visual outlook. So the higher numbers indicate a higher potential for recovery. And these watersheds are color-coded by the group scores. So an index score applies to the watershed as a whole. And this is a general and pretty subjective analysis, but it can be used to prioritize further efforts. So each watershed gets a score or index between 0 and 100. And so let's take another look. In tier 2, we had lots of partners. Let's move on to the next slide. And tier 2 deliverables included developing a communications and outreach strategy, creating a high level of collaboration, identifying and prioritizing 2 pilot projects, and identifying areas suitable as large ecological complexes. So I think we're going to go to the next slide. So we chose a name that was easy to understand, and we have the domain healthylandandwaters.org, healthylandandwater.org. Next slide. So just really briefly, could we go to I just want to show you this, going to the web page, because this is the plan. We do not have a plan that's going to be a bound hard copy sitting anywhere. The tool is going to be living on this web page. So let's scroll down. We have a storyboard here with several stories down on this page. If you could maybe go a little bit quicker, we don't have to read them all, which highlight some of our partners on this project. And then including, our farmers in the region. And then if we go all the way back up to the top, I just want to show you that you can click on our work, for example, and that will give you a lot of the details for this project. Winnesheck Creek is one of the 2 pilot projects, and the other pilot project is the Lower Galena watershed. So we can go out of there and go back to the slide presentation. I think we're getting close to the end here. So the GIS technical group, I just wanted to say here that we incorporated the Nature Conservancy's resilient and connected network to representative of climate resilient sites. So we wanted to include that in our GIS work. Next slide. And the Urban and Developed Lands Working Group has been really working on creating their system, their stressors and indicators. And then briefly to the next slide, pilot areas for implementation include the Winnesheck Creek and the Lower Galena River watershed. And I'm hoping that a lot of these slides will be available for everybody afterwards for them to take a look at. So let's go to the next slide, which shows the Winnesheck Creek. And we chose this because it has an impaired stream. It also has a wastewater treatment plant in it. So this is one of the ones that we actually have received a 319 matching grant using this project as match to create a watershed plan for this. Rebecca Olson is working with us on this from Olson Ecological Services. She's done a lot of work with farmer-led groups. And this is the conceptualizing our green infrastructure network within the Lower Galena River watershed. So now I just want to go to our last 3 slides about implementation funding. And we're still looking to expand the funding for this project. But one of the biggest things is that we are partners in the Illinois RCPP, Regional Conservation Partnership, called the Illinois Working Lands Water and Wildlife Regional Conservation Partnership. with the Conservation Fund. We're also part of the Blufflands Ducks Unlimited RCPP, so that we can assist and work with landowners. Next slide. This is kind of, for those unfamiliar with the RCPP, it provides federal funding to the landowners to put agricultural easements, do restoration, those sorts of things. And we have a lot of partner contributions for that. And last slide is our the RCPP activities that are funded through this: permanent farmland easements, land management, and land rental. So we're very excited to be moving forward with the next phase. The tool, the interactive tool, will be up and available for people to use in the spring, in the early spring. So you can go to healthylandandwater.org and begin to use the plan and use that tool to begin to identify areas for prioritization for your projects. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions.
Thank you, Carrie. I haven't seen any come in. Does anyone have a quick question to type in? Otherwise, we're about back on schedule. Okay, we had a question. How did you find your watershed comparison has worked in identifying places for successful implementation?
So we're currently working at the watershed level, identifying the watersheds where we want to prioritize. The tier 3 or next phase of the project, which we're currently looking at funding, will take us into a deeper dive. But we have started with our 2 pilot projects, which we have identified, and we're going to be doing a deeper dive into those, into the tier 3.
Excellent, thank you. And one other question came in. Is there a website where people can go to put in their address to find out what watershed they're in?
Sure, that's on the EPA. That's in the EPA website, and I don't have it here, but I think Christine Davis is on, and she can maybe type that into chat.
Okay, great. If we can get that, we'll get it typed into the chat box here. Otherwise, I am going to thank Carrie very much for a very informative presentation, and we're going to invite our next speaker to get set up here. Next, we have Lauren Larkins, who's going to present on Mississippi North Central Watershed.